occupational disease thought to be contained during the 1950s is once again on the rise. Exposure to a widely used manufacturing metal is causing increased cases of a little-known illness among workers at the nation's nuclear weapons complex. This has prompted a major effort by the Department of Energy to identify and locate current and former employees who may be at risk of developing the disease. Michael Schrader takes an in-depth look at this obscure illness and the significant advancements made in early detection and treatment.
It's a metal that's found in hundreds of items we see and use every day. For instance, you're likely to find it in car parts, stereo components, eyeglass frames, golf clubs, computer chips, even pins. This extremely strong and lightweight metal is called beryllium, and it's been used in the nuclear industry since the 1940s. Today, because of its many valuable properties, it's also used in the automotive, aerospace, computer, and telecommunications industries. Now, despite its advantages, beryllium does have a downside. In a solid form like this, it poses no threat. But dust created during the manufacturing or scrap reclamation processes can be a hazard if proper precautions are not taken. In the 40s, it was discovered that breathing beryllium dust from the machining process was causing chronic beryllium disease, also known as berylliosis, a scarring lung disease that, in those days, proved fatal in many cases. Improved hygiene and safety during the 50s reduced the incidence of the disease, and the belief arose that compliance with exposure limits would eventually eliminate it altogether. But in 1984, a worker here at the Department of Energy's Rocky Flats plant near Denver, Colorado, was diagnosed with chronic beryllium disease. Following this discovery, additional precautions were put in place at the plant, but for many these measures were too late. Exposure to beryllium particles had already taken place during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and following the 1984 case, many more workers were diagnosed with the disease. The Department of Energy initiated a health surveillance program at Rocky Flats to test workers for beryllium exposure. This pilot testing program will eventually be expanded to all DOE facilities where beryllium has been used. The department is also trying to locate all former beryllium workers throughout the U.S. and in some foreign countries.
Well, I think it's fairly unprecedented in terms of size. I don't know of many health surveillance recall studies that have been done in the country that would be of this magnitude. There wouldn't be very many that would ever have been larger.
It's driven by the desire to do right by the workers who worked in these plants, that if their health has been impacted from work in these plants, that we do what we can to make sure that those health impacts are minimized through early identification and treatment, and that they're properly compensated, that they get the workers' compensation insurance that they're due.
Beryllium disease develops when people have inhaled beryllium and their lungs end up being the battlefield for a type of allergic reaction. The first thing that happens is a person inhales particles of beryllium in the form of dust or fume into the lungs. Once the beryllium travels down through the bronchial tubes into the deep parts of the lung called the air sacs, the body then sees it and sets up a reaction. The first thing that happens in that reaction is that cells that live in the lung, that are scavenger cells, travel around, they see the particles, and they try to gobble up and engulf the particles. Once they have gobbled up the particles of beryllium, they will show the beryllium to other cells, and those other cells, called lymphocytes, will react by growing and dividing and building an army of cells inside the lung. The type of damage that occurs is a thickening of the lung itself. And once that thickening has occurred, then the lung can't do the job that it's meant to do. It can't get the oxygen from the air that we breathe to go into the bloodstream, where it then gets carried to the rest of the body. So people with beryllium disease start to become starved for oxygen.
And it's an insidious disease. It creeps up on people. They often attribute the early symptoms to aging or being out of shape, something like that.
It typically takes anywhere from 6 to 10 years from the time that someone's first exposed to beryllium to when they start to develop any kind of symptoms of the disease. And for many people, it may be 20 or 30 years since they have been around beryllium before they start to get the signs of this disease.
The major problem is that beryllium doesn't cause a unique disease. In other words, it's not a set of signs and symptoms that would make somebody think, aha, this has to be beryllium disease, nothing else.
Even for doctors, beryllium disease acts like a lot of other lung diseases, and doctors and patients alike have difficulty sorting out whether it's beryllium disease or something else.
The symptoms are really of a chronic progressive respiratory disease where you may have cough, shortness of breath, occasionally some chest pain.
Fatigue is a very common symptom. Now, lots of things can cause fatigue, but this is one of the symptoms of beryllium disease. Some people will develop weight loss that they can't explain. Others will have problems with night sweats where during sleep they'll just wake up from sleep completely drenched.
If the disease is unrecognized and it continues to progress, they'll get more and more lung disease, and so they'll get shorter and shorter breath, and then they may develop heart failure because of the severity of their lung disease.
The only way to find out if you have beryllium disease is to be tested. The exam involves a chest x-ray, breathing evaluation, and a blood test. The chest x-ray could reveal telling signs, like lung scarring or lymph node swelling. Of the three, the blood test is the best indicator because it is very specific to beryllium disease.
So essentially what this test measures, if the cells are sensitive to beryllium, they proliferate and grow. If they're not sensitive, the cells just ignore beryllium.
Abnormal means that compared to people who have never been exposed to beryllium, it means that your blood has reacted, that you have cells in your body that see beryllium as a foreign invader, and those cells are there reacting.
What the workers who are having the test should know is that this is a test that does have some false positive results and some false negative results. It's not a perfect test.
The blood test is not 100% certain. The blood test, though, is the best that we have available at this point in time. And in my experience, it's been greater than 90% certain.
The blood test can also identify the disease in people who don't have any symptoms yet because of the long latency period.
When people go through this kind of screening program, we very often find people who have an abnormal blood test showing that they react to beryllium. And then when we do other tests to investigate that, we find out that they have beryllium disease, and they may have no symptoms at all at that early stage.
Those other tests are required to make an accurate diagnosis because not everyone with a positive blood test and x-ray has chronic beryllium disease. There are some risks involved, and your doctor will explain them to you if necessary. However, not all of these risks are medical.
Some people will find that once they're diagnosed with beryllium disease, it may affect their insurability status. They may have trouble getting life insurance or getting other forms of insurance. There is the potential problem of being able to find other jobs. If you have to leave the beryllium industry, will you be able to find other kinds of work?
For these reasons, some people with no symptoms have chosen to put off the tests. Currently, doctors don't know how much exposure it takes to cause beryllium disease, but we do know this: the greater the exposure, the greater the risk. And there are exceptions. Some people with very small exposures have contracted the disease.
I had one individual who I see who was a salesperson in the beryllium industry. His only exposure was the first 6 months that he went to work for the industry. As part of the orientation, they had him view all the different processes in the plant. And then he was never in the plant again. And I think it was about 5 or 7 years after that initial exposure that he developed the disease.
There are people who develop beryllium disease who work directly with beryllium, and there are some people who are more on the edge of where the beryllium is being handled. So we have seen security guards, secretaries, people who handled laundry that was contaminated, as well as people who worked day in and day out machining beryllium or doing casting or in other ways grinding, polishing, hands-on work.
In the defense industry where beryllium was used a lot and everything was on a need-for-no basis, there may be many people who worked around beryllium, but because they didn't need to know it, did not know that they were actually exposed.
A lot of people work with beryllium for very short periods of time. I can't remember all the offices I've worked in, and you do forget a lot of the details of your career as you move on. And so it's quite likely that a number of people who will end up notifying from records will have forgotten that they ever worked with beryllium.
If you've ever been around any sort of a beryllium manufacturing operation, I think it's prudent probably to be tested. I think there are a lot of things that we don't know about the disease yet. We're in our infancy in terms of learning about that.
We don't really know at this time why some people get it and others do not. It's probably in part related to the amount of beryllium that someone's been exposed to, and it may in part be related to some kind of genetic factor that hasn't really been worked out yet.
Since the 1950s, treatments have become available that reduce lung damage caused by the disease and enable most patients to live a normal life.
The standard treatment for people with beryllium disease is to give them a medicine in pill form which is called prednisone. This is a type of corticosteroid. Steroids are medicines that are used to cut down the inflammation that's going on in the lung.
The drugs do have negative side effects, so the decision to take them should be made after talking with a doctor. This treatment usually halts progression of the disease, especially when it is caught early.
First of all, if you already have beryllium disease, it allows you to have a much more clear idea of what the future will bring for you, what doctors call prognosis. The second reason to know is that if you have beryllium disease at an early stage, your doctors need that information in order to be able to follow much more carefully how your lung health is doing, so that over the years, if you're showing signs of worsening, the doctors are there ready to treat. The third reason for going through this kind of screening is that if you have beryllium disease, even sometimes at fairly early stages, it could be taking a toll on your health and may require treatment.
The problem is that if the disease is detected late, this allergy sets up a reaction that causes fibrosis, scarring, and destruction of the tissue. And once lung tissue is destroyed, there's nothing that can make it regenerate or regrow.
I believe we've had an excellent response. I think all of the individuals so far that we've tested, we've gotten, by and large, when they go to either National Jewish or the hospitals at the University of Pennsylvania, we often get reports back, and all of the reports that we've gotten back have been extraordinarily satisfactory. And you know, in a few instances, we've had individuals, for example, have been found not to have chronic beryllium disease, but they have found to have other medical health problems. And they've been very thankful for having found those things and being able to deal with them at an appropriate time.
Scientists estimate as many as 800,000 workers have been exposed to beryllium dust in government and private plants across the United States. If you were one of these, you owe it to yourself to get an exam and find out if you have the disease. This is Mike Schrader reporting.
In addition to the Department of Energy sites, there are occupational medical clinics in various states where testing is available, or in some cases, a private physician can perform the exam. For information on where you can get tested, or if you would just like further information about chronic beryllium disease, contact the number on your screen.